We're in trial in the state of Ohio. Southern Ohio, nearest big city to this case would be Cincinnati. This is the case over the death of Rachelle Bresaugh. Police and prosecutors, they're alleging here that she was stabbed 55 times by her boyfriend of 27 years, Toby Madden. He's the defendant, and he has had a history during this case of melting down. And if I was a betting woman, I would bet he's going to have another meltdown in a couple of seconds here, because the state just called the doctor who performed the autopsy on Rachelle's body on October the 12th of 2022. So let's go in now and see what the doctor says.
I want to direct your attention to October 12th of 2022. At that time, were you asked to perform an autopsy on the body of Rachelle Bresaugh?
I was, yes.
Okay. And where was that autopsy performed at?
At the Butler County Morgue here in the city of Hamilton.
Okay. And did you take photographs? I believe you said as part of an autopsy you take photographs. But during Rachelle's autopsy, did you photograph the body in that autopsy?
Well, I personally did not take the pictures. Typically, it's either the investigator or the morgue assistant who is assisting with the autopsy is the one that actually takes the photographs under my direction. Yes.
Okay. Would those photos aid you in your testimony today?
Yes.
If I may approach the witness.
You may.
Doctor, if you would take a look, please, at exhibits 178 through 205, and just flip through them and take a look at all those and let me know when you're done looking at them. And I'm sorry, Mr. Wilder, I didn't show them to you, but it's 178 through 205 on the...
Okay, yeah, I got it on my computer.
Right.
Thank you.
Have you had a chance to look at all those?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And generally speaking, what are exhibits 178 through 205 photos of?
These are photos that were taken during the course of the autopsy.
Okay.
Some of them are external photographs, and some of them are a few of the internal organs.
Okay. And these are photos taken during Rachelle Bresaugh's autopsy that you performed, correct?
Yes.
All right. And these, are they true, fair, and accurate depictions of the autopsy you performed on Rachelle's body?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, I would ask that State's Exhibits 178 through 205 be admitted and be allowed to publish.
Mr. Wilder?
We have a brief sidebar.
Sure. Oh, what is going to come with this sidebar being requested by the defense? Will they stipulate? Perhaps they should stipulate to the cause and the manner of death, because we know what they're challenging here isn't how Rachelle Bresaugh was killed. It's who killed her. They're saying that it wasn't the defendant. He's saying that 3 guys went into the house that apparently were after him because of some drug activity. So why not just stipulate and not put the jurors through that, not put his own daughter through that? Stipulate. Let's see what they do.
As part of your duties, do you create a report for each autopsy you perform for the Butler County Coroner's Office?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And I guess you do that for any county you perform an autopsy in, correct?
Yes.
All right. Did you generate a report for the autopsy of Rachelle Bresaugh?
Yes, I did.
And is that report kept in the ordinary course of business for the Butler County Coroner's Office?
Yes.
Okay. And would that report aid you in your testimony to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury here today?
Yes, it would.
Okay. May I approach the witness again?
Mr. Wiley.
206.
Okay.
Dr. Remigio, State's Exhibit 206. Can you please take a look at that and identify Exhibit 206? And what is that exhibit?
It is a copy of the autopsy report, which I created, and there's also a copy of the toxicology report, which I personally do not generate. The specimens that are submitted are recovered during the autopsy, but obviously the testing is done by a toxicological laboratory.
Okay. It's part of your report, though, the toxicology report?
Well, it's included as in the exhibit, and I certainly use that information when making a decision about the cause and manner of death. But I'm just clarifying that I did not generate that toxicology report.
All right. Is Exhibit 206, though, a true and accurate, fair representation of the original that you created in the toxicology report that you received to aid you in your autopsy and in determining a cause and manner of death?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I would ask that State's Exhibit 206 be admitted and permission to publish it at any time if needed. I don't believe I will, but...
I have a brief second.
Sure. Okay, so we've got another sidebar there. Let's talk, though. About how there is no stipulation. Is this defendant looking for an opportunity to cry again? That's what I want to know. Let's bring back in our guests, Judge Amy Corrigal-Jones and law enforcement expert Sonny Slaughter. Okay, is this guy trying to create an opportunity here? Judge, talk to us a little bit about legally what can happen with the stipulation and the choices involved that both sides have here, please.
Sure. I think Attorney Slaughter had mentioned this earlier. Sometimes from the defense perspective, they want to minimize the emotional response from the jury. So at times, if a client will allow it, although Madden doesn't seem that he's that type, they want to try to move through the evidence. And as you said, it's not it happened, it's who did it, alleged, that's what they're claiming. So from that perspective, that's what a reasonable defense lawyer would do. But we're talking about a defendant who's blown through or fired, I think, 5 lawyers. So you have that, and then you have from the state's point of view, and Julie, you being a former prosecutor, you can speak to that. They want to move through that evidence as efficiently as possible, but also I think they're trying to balance also the emotional trauma that's associated with one for the jurors, but again, those family members and that poor daughter sitting in the courtroom. So again, the judge is always balancing, making a record, making sure the evidence is admitted in accordance with the rules. So, but again, when you're dealing with someone like this, all rules and sometimes decorum fly out the window.
Isn't that the truth? Judge, thank you for that. Thank you for that explainer on that. And as you were talking, I'm getting notes in. As you all know, we have our team in the courtroom there, and our director of courtroom coverage, Grace Wong, sent us a note about how, remember when the defendant was walking in a few minutes ago and I was saying, I'm not a lip reader, but he was pointing to his beard and saying something about shaving. So apparently what he was heard saying, and the jury wasn't in there, but he was complaining to someone in the gallery, presumably his daughter or family member, someone, about not getting a shower in 4 days' time. 4 days' time. He's saying he hasn't been given a shower in the jail. Sonny Slaughter, let me go to you on this one, please. Your reaction hearing that as this defendant is right smack dab in the middle of his trial?
You know, I think that if that is the case, then his attorney, if that is true, then his attorney needs to address that, because he does need to be properly prepared for court, which means he needs to be able to get up, get the shower, and have things. You know, even though this is a criminal trial, even though he is alleged to be guilty, and even if he is guilty, there is still some humanity that we must show to the defendants, and there is constitutional process that they have. Now, I'm not saying that they must take a shower, but they must be treated with and served in humane conditions, and taking a shower before he comes to court is one of those things that I would be remiss if not saying that is due to him, so he can be, in good condition. Now, his theatrics to this might be otherwise, and there might be a reason why he didn't get a shower that day that he arrived there. So that all has to be taken into consideration, but he needs to address it with his attorney and not to the gallery, who can't do anything about it. He's just theatrical and wants more attention.
Right, Sonny. I agree with everything you said. You know, prisoners have rights. Certainly, he's deserving of all of the basic needs being taken care of in the jail: the showering, the food, the sleep, all of those things, medication if there's any need for that. So you're right. Why direct it to people in the gallery? I wonder if he's playing it up for our cameras. You know, he's obviously aware that this is being filmed. You know, he should perhaps have his attorney direct it to the judge. And since we have a judge on the program, Judge Amy, tell us so let's say that it was a concern. Let's say the lawyer says, you know, before the jury's brought in, you know, Judge, my client just informed me it's been 4 days. How does this get handled?
Sure. The Sheriff's Office in Hamilton County, like other counties across the state of Ohio, work very closely with the courts to make certain that individuals like Mr. Madden's safe and well-being is addressed, and so they would handle that if in fact it was true, although again, I would presume under these circumstances it's not. But they work as collaborative partners to ensure the well-being of these inmates and any individual that's charged with such an offense.
I really appreciate the insight from you both. Judge Amy Corrigal-Jones, Sonny Slaughter, stand by, please. We're going to hit a break. When we go back in the courtroom, we'll see what we learn from the autopsy that was conducted on the body of Rachelle Bresaugh. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm your host, Julie Grant. Right now, we're tracking several trials for you in Ohio. We've got the stabbed 55 times murder trial. This one's underway against Toby Madden. And we're getting word right now of another meltdown. This guy is accused of fatally stabbing his longtime girlfriend, Rachelle Bresaugh. In South Carolina, day 2 of the jealous husband murder trial begins today. Defendant William Bud Ackerman is accused of murdering Kenneth McClendon, the man who was dating his estranged wife. Court starts up at 10 a.m. And in Florida, we've got testimony resuming in the killed while calling 911 case. Bree Kuhn, a petty officer in the Navy, is accused of murdering her husband while he was on the phone with a 911 dispatcher. Let's take you back into the courtroom now for the case against Toby Madden. We've got the forensic pathologist on the stand, and we're getting word of a big outburst, an outburst coming from the gallery. Let's watch.
Dr. Uptegrove, can you please explain to the jury the process of performing an autopsy, starting with the moment you received the body?
Well, the external examination is what happens first, and it's a combination of writing things down, documenting things, hair color, eye color, any kind of scars or other identifying marks, whether there's any medical intervention on the body, any obvious injuries, and those things are also documented via photographs that either the investigator or the autopsy assistant may take. So once the external exam has been completed, we begin the internal exam, and as I alluded to earlier, that involves removal of the internal organs. So in a case like this, when I can clearly see that there's been multiple stab wounds on the outer surface of the body, we're looking at documenting, identifying any type of internal injuries or damage, which organs may or may not be affected from these stab wounds. In addition to that, again, we're looking for things like coronary artery disease, cancer, cirrhosis of the liver, other types of diseases that may involve other organs in the body, any obvious sign of infection. So after the organs are removed, they are weighed and dissected individually. And then after the autopsy, the majority of the tissue is then returned to the body. We retain a few small pieces, like I said earlier. In the event we need to do a microscopic examination, we have small pieces of tissue that can be submitted if that was necessary. And then after the toxicology testing is completed, then the autopsy report would be finalized. So I don't finalize a report until I've got the final toxicology report to make sure that you're not surprised by some significantly elevated drug or other substance present in the body.
Okay. And can you just take us through the physical description of Rachelle Bresaug's body, please?
Sure. She was 65 inches in height, which is 5'5", and she was 232 pounds. Again, it was fairly obvious because of the number of stab wounds present on her head, her chest, her abdomen, her arms. There's one on her leg, on her back, that she had sustained multiple stab wounds. So again, this is one of these types of cases where just during the initial external examination, it was fairly obvious to me as far as what the cause of death was going to be.
Okay. Just start showing you the photos and go through those now. We can see Exhibit 178, please. I believe that's the first one. Yes. Doctor, obviously it's on the screen there in front of you and should be, I think it's on the screen in front of you, isn't it? Okay.
Yes, it is.
And then on the big screen there. Can you please explain to the jury what we're looking at in State's Exhibit 178?
Okay, this is a placard. Again, that's not my handwriting on there, but the people at the Butler County Coroner's Office in the morgue will write the case number, which is that 22-1012 is the case number that was assigned to this, and it has the decedent's name, and it has the date that the autopsy was performed, October 12th, 2022. And of course, Dr. Lisa Mannix is the coroner for Butler County.
Okay, thank you. If we could go to 179. And please describe Exhibit 179.
All right, this is something that we do in all the autopsies, basically taking a shot of the face in order for identification purposes, because some of the times when we do autopsies on people, they're not identified at the time. So it's nice to have a photograph of the person's face for potentially identification purposes. In this particular case, it also documents that there is an injury on her nose that can be visualized here.
Okay. 180, please. And tell us what we're looking at in State's Exhibit 180, please.
Okay.
If anyone cannot compose themselves in the courtroom, then they're going to need to leave the courtroom. Okay? Go ahead, Mr. Vaughn.
I'm sorry, Doctor. Please describe what we're looking at in State's Exhibit 180.
All right. In this picture, it's focusing predominantly on the anterior aspect of the chest and the abdomen. You can also see the left hand and the left forearm and left upper arm in this picture, but as I mentioned, there were multiple stab wounds. The vast majority of the stab wounds she sustained were in the chest and abdominal area. There were a few on the hands and arms, but predominantly chest and abdomen.
Okay. And what do we see protruding from some of the wounds?
Okay. In the right lower quadrant, there's actually the yellow is some of the abdominal fat, and then there's also a portion of the small intestine which is protruding through one of the stab wounds.
And can you just, you should be able to touch that screen and circle which ones you're talking about, I think. Wait a minute. Sorry. Now you should be able to.
All right.
What are you circling there,
That
Doctor?
is, well, the yellow part is fat, and then this little tubular here, that's the small part of the small intestine.
Okay. And then the other one above or to the left of it?
That is mental fat, and then there's again some fat and another little piece of intestine protruding through there.
Okay. All right. And then if you go to the top right corner of your screen, that little arrow, you can hit that and then hit clear, and it should take the.
Okay.
Thank you. States Exhibit 181, please. Doctor, what are we looking at in States Exhibit 181?
Okay, now we're looking at her from the left side, and it's some of the pictures that are taken in the course of the autopsy. Sometimes they're taken as is, received with whatever clothing, or if there's blood or dirt. Clearly in this picture here, as compared to the last one, some of that blood that was present on her chest and abdomen on the skin has been wiped away to better illustrate the size and configuration of some of these stab wounds. So again, there's multiple stab wounds on the chest and abdomen. Again, on this left side, there's intestines which are protruding through that hole there. If you look at her left hand, there's actually some small injuries on the hand, contusion on the hand. There's another superficial wound there on that forearm. So this kind of shows you the relative symmetrical involvement of the right side of the chest and abdomen and the left side of the chest and abdomen.
Okay. And the injuries on the hands and arms, do those signify anything to you?
Well, I consider those to be defensive type wounds, and I believe we will see some photographs that are more close-up showing trauma to the hands and in between the fingers, forearms, locations typically seen when an individual is trying to defend themselves during an attack like this.
Okay. And if I may, because I don't have a screen to point at, is that all right if I walk? Okay. Doctor, some of these wounds look darker than other ones, and some look lighter. Does that signify anything to you?
Well, what can happen in cases where people have sustained a large number of stab wounds, there's a couple of different things that can happen. Number one, if you sustained a stab wound that hit a vital structure like the brainstem or a large knife that damaged, significant damage to the heart, an individual could die fairly quickly. In other cases where there's multiple stab wounds, if there's not severe enough trauma to an individual organ, it's possible that the cause of death is more from exsanguination or bleeding to death, more so from an individual organ being so damaged that it would cause an immediate death. So when there's this many stab wounds, sometimes some of the wounds, as they're inflicted, and I can't put any kind of order on when these wounds were sustained, but some of the wounds have very little bleeding in the subcutaneous tissue and the fat, and that's because some of these wounds may have happened as the person is quite close to death or actually has died because the heart is no longer beating because of the amount of blood that has been lost from the circulatory system. So some of the wounds don't show much subcutaneous hemorrhage.
Okay. And could you just point out the difference of, like, I know we may be able to see this on some other photographs, but can you point out the difference between, like, two of the wounds?
This one here, there's very little bleeding. I mean, all you're seeing really is the yellow fat, where a lot of these other wounds, there's much more redness associated with the soft tissue.
Okay, thank you. If you want to hit clear there. Can we go on to 182, please? And can you please describe Exhibit 182 to the jury, please?
Okay, in this particular photograph, there's a couple of things we're looking at. Number one, there's things that I would call an acute contusion or a bruise on the hand right here, and then on this area where the knuckles are, there's some purple discoloration. And again, I can't say how it happened, but some sort of blunt force to the hand, which causes a bruise. In addition to that, there's also a couple of superficial injuries to the hand, which are more consistent with a sharp force type of situation.
Okay, thank you. Clear those out. Exhibit 183. Can you please describe Exhibit 183?
Okay, this is a closer up image, and the hand is slightly rotated for this picture, again showing that rather large contusion or bruise on the left at the base of that index finger. And what we're looking at here is kind of in the web in between the index finger and the thumb, and that soft tissue is a wound from sharp force injury. Again, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, as far as what I would consider a defensive type wound, that could be present on the hands or the forearms during the course of an assault.
Okay, thank you. 184. And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 184?
All right. Again, this is showing the left hand and the left forearm. And, the thing that it's variable when we're looking, even just on the chest and the abdomen, the shape and the orientation of what these stab wounds look like. They're not all the same size. Some of them are curved. Some of them are more straight. So when this person is moving, that can alter what a wound looks like. Also, when you have something like this, the hand and the forearm, there's a lot less flesh, fat, other subcutaneous tissue, muscle on the hand and the arm as opposed to the chest and the abdomen. So sometimes when a knife penetrates the soft tissue, and if it hits a bone, the knife doesn't protrude as deep as it would if it was on a chest or an abdomen. So sometimes these wounds can be much more superficial just because the blade doesn't effectively penetrate as much. So these particular wounds here are, I would say, much more superficial or shallow compared to some of the wounds that we saw in the chest and abdomen. But again, they're certainly significant. These types.
I want to mention something today, my friends. Today in America, September 25th, is the National Day of Remembrance for Homicide Victims. And I was just seeing a post from the National Center for Victims of Crime. I am on their board and saw them put it up on social media. And in the post, they're talking about how victims have to endure such strength as the days and the weeks go on. And I'm thinking about this as we're watching Michaela in the courtroom. We're watching Rachelle's daughter, Michaela, crying, breaking down as she's watching these terrible photos be displayed and the coroner go through every bit of the autopsy done on her mother. And it makes me think how it's not over today. Today is one day, but she's going to have to continue enduring that strength day after day after day for the rest of her life. We'll be right back after this quick break.
Sarah Boone is charged with second-degree murder after her boyfriend suffocated inside of a suitcase.
He's in the suitcase still.
There are multiple domestic violence incidents.
You two hitting each other. Sarah. That's my name. Don't wear it up.
He told you, Sarah, I can't breathe.
George Torres locked inside of a suitcase, begging for help.
I thought he was okay.
The Suitcase Murder Trial. Live coverage starting October 7th on Court TV.
We are so grateful for your company on this Wednesday morning. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julie Grant. We are seeing a really heartbreaking moment taking place in a trial in Southern Ohio. The moment where the autopsy evidence is put into the case. Because in any homicide, the prosecutor has to establish the cause and the manner of death. And so here, it's pretty obvious, it's pretty obvious the way in which Rachelle Bresaugh was so brutally taken from us. But we have the defense team presumably wanting this to go before the jury because they could stipulate. They could say, we stipulate to the good doctor's findings of the way in which Rachelle Bresaugh died, and that is the end of that, and we move forward. They're not. And everybody in the gallery is watching it closely, including Rachelle's daughter, Michaela. It is really heartbreaking seeing her taking all of this in. And it is the choice of someone who is a surviving victim like that, to stay in the courtroom. By all means, she is welcome to stay or welcome to exit. And she's made a choice to be there and to look at it. So as we go back in, just be mindful that these are some of the most gruesome photos that could be presented before a jury. Think about the number of stab wounds, 55 wounds to this woman's body at the time of her death. Let's go back in.
Significant. I mean, these type of wounds you're not going to bleed to death from these, but it shows or indicates that this individual was alive and at the time when this assault occurred.
All right, thank you. 185. And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 185?
Okay, we've got, again, we're still on this left arm here, and again, on the forearm, there's this kind of a superficial penetrating wound here. Down here towards the elbow, this is very superficial. And then you can see here that there's this wound here is much larger and much deeper, and you can actually see there's this kind of white, shiny area, and that's actually one of the tendons, in the lower forearm, in the wrist area, and that is a much deeper injury than some of these other things that we've previously viewed.
Okay, thank you. 186. Oh, yeah, sorry. Is it not working?
I don't have the option to. I don't. Have
maybe just tap up. Just try and tap up there. It might bring it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do. Thanks.
And this is State's Exhibit 186. Can you please explain this photo?
Yeah. So this is again with the hand being rotated or the arm being rotated, and a little bit more close in from that last image that we saw, showing that there's this much deeper, more of a gaping type of stab wound, and has transected several of the tendons in this wrist area. And that's what you can see here, and here, and here.
All right. Thank you. And if you can clear that out. 187. And what do we see here in State's Exhibit 187?
Okay, again, in this image, we're closer in, a couple things. Number one, I think you could appreciate that there's a lot of variation in what these wounds look like. They're not all the same size. Some of them don't have very much hemorrhage. It's almost just yellow fat. This situation has some intestines protruding. Both of these wounds have subcutaneous hemorrhage associated with it. This This wound here is a little unique because you can actually see that there's a sharp end, a little pointy end here, and there's a blunt end, on the other end there. So it also has very little hemorrhage associated with it. So,
Okay, all right. You want to clear that out? And what are we looking at in State's Exhibit 188?
And we're the same basic sort of orientation, except we're a little bit more over the body. And again, some of these, like this here, very superficial, but clearly some type of sharp force injury there and right there. Here's another one of these wounds where there is a pretty identifiable blunt end here, and there's a little bit more of a pointed sharp end there. Again, that would be one of these wounds when compared to this one, which this one here has much more hemorrhage associated with it. But like I said, I can't put any sort of sequence on when these individual wounds were sustained.
Okay, thank you. 189. And what are we looking at in State's Exhibit 189?
Again, I didn't take these pictures, but again, this picture is another illustration of comparing this end. There's somewhat of a blunt end, and again, at the time I'm doing the autopsy, I don't have any idea as far as what type of sharp force implement was used. However, you can see in some of these that there is a blunt end, a one end, and a more pointed end opposite to that. And I think that's...
Hold on one second, Doctor.
Whoever's got some kind of electronic on it needs to be turned off. If another device goes off, it's going to be confiscated by the court. It's important that the jurors be able to hear the testimony. And I'd also ask that people refrain from going inside and outside of the courtroom on a regular basis. Of course, if you need to leave at some point because you can't keep your composure, you can do that, but let's try to do it quietly and not distract from the testimony. You may continue.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
this particular wound that's adjacent to this ruler, again, it's, of course, a ruler's used for scale just to give some sort of a dimension about the size, but again, there's a blunt end here, a little bit more of a sharp end here. In the same view here, there's another blunt end there with more of a pointy end here, but this wound has very little to no hemorrhage associated with it compared to the one in the corner. Again, it's just sort of a compare and contrast.
And that scale there, Doctor, is that like how the two that you, or the one that has the ruler around it, like what are the dimensions of that?
That one is about 3.5 centimeters in length.
Okay. And the width, I guess, would be how many centimeters, if you can tell?
The width in that one is going to be about 1.25 centimeters.
Okay.
And again, the thing about, just to explain, there's different types of elastic fibers throughout your body beneath the skin. So it depends on how, when a sharp force injury is implemented, it depends on whether or not you're cutting in parallel with these elastic fibers or more perpendicular. So theoretically, you could take the same implement, and depending on how hard or not as hard of a stab was implemented, the shape of the wound can vary significantly based on the location on the body because of these elastic fibers, which could cause a wound to potentially gape open. So that's why some of these just look very different.
And can I have 1 second? All right, you want to hit clear on that one, Doc? Okay. 180 or 190, I'm sorry. And what do we have here in State's Exhibit 190?
Okay, so this picture is taken from the head looking downward towards the upper chest. And again, there's multiple more hemorrhagic wounds here on the right breast. A couple of these ones over here on the left breast, not nearly as much subcutaneous hemorrhage. There's also, over on this left sort of anterior shoulder area, there's some faint bruising here with some very superficial injuries that I can't necessarily call that a stab wound, but I mean, it could be fingernail scratch, it could be an abrasion from falling and hitting something, but they're just much more minor injuries compared to what we're seeing on the chest.
Thank you. You clear that out. Let's go to 191. And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 191?
Okay, this is more of a close-up view of the right side of the lower abdomen, where we had seen earlier there's fat protruding through the stab wound here. This is small intestine here, there's small intestine here, and again, to show this wound here, there's more of a blunt end here and a really kind of a sharp, more pointed end on that particular wound, which there's very little hemorrhage associated with that one.
All right, thank you.
Again, give yourself a little mental picture of how bad this is. 55 wounds on this woman's body, and we know that some of them were so deep and so gaping that her, body fat and intestines, were protruding through these wounds. That is what was the, trigger, I should call it, for the outburst we heard in the gallery. This is the victim's photo on the day that we remember homicide victims, especially in America, September 25th. This is Rachelle Bresaugh. And her daughter, Michaela, was in the gallery at the time the outburst happened. We're not sure if it came from her, but want to play back that moment where someone shouted out the word bastard, presumably at the defendant.
And tell us what we're looking at in State's Exhibit 180, please.
Okay.
Okay. If anyone cannot compose themselves in the courtroom, then they're going to need to leave the courtroom.
And I noticed something watching that video back. It looked like someone in the row behind Michaela kind of put their arm out, reached out to sort of calm her down and tap her shoulder. So perhaps it did come from Michaela. Who could blame her if it did? That was her mother who was killed. And there's Michaela right there. We see her in the moments after crying, being consoled by the two women, on each side of her as she's looking at these photos of her mom. Because remember, her mom and her dad were a couple for 27 years. 27 years. She is the child born of their relationship. And now he's the defendant and she is the deceased victim. I want to bring in our guest analyst now and get his thoughts. Trial attorney Kenan Kearney on the show with us. Kenan, good morning to you. What did you think as you rewatched that clip of the outburst from the gallery?
Well, good morning, Julie. I know for as hard as it is for me to watch this, kudos to Michaela for being able to stay in the courtroom and observe all of these horrid and terrible pictures. Kudos to the judge for also being able to take control of her courtroom. When someone yells bastard, that could in itself affect the juror from being able to hear the evidence that is being testified about. That could affect the juror, and where if it came from Michaela, then they may seek sympathy for her and go after the defendant more. So kudos to the judge for ensuring that these type of outbursts don't continue, because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is that the person who committed this horrible crime is behind bars. So I would assume that the judge will continue to give instructions like she did about people walking in and out. I would assume that the judge would continue to monitor if electronics or people are speaking out, because at this time, the defendant truly deserves his constitutional right to have this tried before a jury of his peers. And so kudos to the judge for ensuring as much tranquility as she can in this crazy and horrible situation before her in this courtroom.
Cannon, thank you for that. Stand by kindly, please. We're going to hit a break. When we come back, we'll go back into the courtroom and see what's happening as the forensic pathologist wraps up his testimony. Back to court we go. We have our cameras in the courtroom in Ohio for the stabbed 55 times. Think about that, 55 times murder trial. The victim's Rachelle Bresaugh. Her daughter is watching the autopsy photos of her mother be presented for this jury. Let's go back in together now.
Thank you. 192. What are we looking at in this one?
So now this is an image of the right hand, and very similar in appearance to the left hand in that fact that there is a contusion or bruising acutely here on the right thumb. There's another bruise you can see up here on the right kind of wrist, forearm area. And like the left hand, some of these injuries on the hand are relatively superficial compared to the types of injuries that we saw on the chest and abdomen. But again, something that really is kind of a classic example of a defensive type of injury.
Thank you. You can clear that one. 193. And what do we have here in 193?
Okay, this is a picture of the right arm, like very kind of a superficial type of sharp force injury, but it's also surrounded by a bruise or contusions, dark purple discoloration there. Again, that doesn't really extend just barely through the skin, so there's no significant damage beneath this wound. But again, with its anatomic location, and what we're seeing here is again consistent with another one of these defensive type of wounds.
Okay, and let's go on to the next one then.
194?
Yes. What do we have here in State's Exhibit 194?
Okay, this is again a closer up image of the face, which we previously saw in the identification picture earlier. This injury is present on the nose. It is roughly kind of a linear type of injury, but again, it does not extend very deep. It doesn't really penetrate deep into the subcutaneous tissue. So again, this wound would not have caused any major injury or trauma, but again, it's just something that's documented, and I can't say exactly how this occurred in the course of the circumstance. But also, if you look up here, that just at the top of the hairline, there's another one of these very superficial type of injuries. And again, this one is located literally right against the skull, and knife wouldn't have been able to really penetrate deep, so it's very superficial. Where this thing here on the nose, there's a little bit more soft tissue on the nose as compared to this forehead, but because there is a little bit more tissue, I think that's why this one is a little bit more substantial in size.
Okay, thank you. 195. And what do we have here in State's Exhibit 195?
Okay, so now we've, the photograph is now taken from the perspective of the top of the head. So this injury here in the corner where the ruler is what we just previously looked at, the injury at the top of the kind of the forehead right there at the hairline. Again, very superficial sharp force injury. And also in this picture, you can see that there's some additional injuries more on the top of the head as well.
All right, thank you. There we go, 196. What do we have here in 196?
Okay, so what I did is, in order to better illustrate these, some of the hair, I did shave on the top of the head from some of those images we just saw to show that, again, there are these superficial stab wounds to the top of the head. And again, because they do not penetrate through the skull, there's a very shallow depth to these things. But again, when a knife hits the bone and it's not able to fully penetrate, you can get varying sizes and different orientations in these wounds, and that's what we have here. None of these three, look the same.
Ooh, this is brutal, going through this. Let me bring back in our guest, legal analyst, Kenan Kearney. Kenan, you were just talking about how distractions in the courtroom, outbursts, could jeopardize the defendant's right to a fair trial. What about what he's doing? He's creating a lot of distractions all by himself, isn't he? Your thoughts on that?
So, Julie, that's actually the point that I was hoping that you would bring up, is the credibility of the witness. And so the judge and the jury have a few things or tangible things that they can look at to go at his credibility. His demeanor, previous crimes, court presence. So all of these things the jury is looking at. So whether he's, as we've been told, arguing with his attorney in the middle of the courtroom, whether he's doing stabbing motions to the prosecution and saying, I'm sorry, whether he's unable to console himself as if guilt is on him. Many times in these situations, we don't actually get the real. Here, we're getting the real. We have an actual defendant who cannot control his emotions. We have a daughter who's in the courtroom who cannot control herself. So seeing all of these things is definitely going to influence the juror. So based on what I'm seeing, it seems as if he's showing a lot of guilt instead of remorse. But how could you tell the difference? It's such a thin line. So these are all things that the jury will be dealing with when they go into deliberations.
Exactly. Kenan Kearney, thank you much. Stand by, please. We're going to hit a break. We'll go back to the courtroom live right after this.
An Ohio man charged in the gruesome death of his longtime girlfriend.
They was yelling, she's dead, she's dead.
The Stabbed 55 Times Murder Trial. Live coverage today on Court TV.
A 17-year-old boy charged with killing 2 people during a chaotic protest.
I intended to stop the people who were attacking me.
Victim to Verdict with Ted Rollins. All new Sunday night, 8/7 Central.
Only on Court TV.
Order. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julie Grant. Let's get you back in the courtroom in Ohio for the Stabbed 55 Times murder trial. On the stand, the forensic pathologist who did the autopsy of Rachelle Bresaugh.
Look the same, but they're all caused by a penetrating stab.
Okay, thank you. On 197. What do we have here in State's Exhibit 197?
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the majority of these wounds were on the chest and abdomen. Some more superficial ones on the hands and forearms. Well, this is the only one that was present on the left upper back. And during the course of the autopsy, again, in the beginning, we're taking this picture, so the body has not been opened up, so there's still, blood inside the body, and in manipulating the body, blood can still come out of an injury, especially on the posterior aspect of the body where a person has been laying on their back and you see blood settling. Well, that's what all this purple is. This is livor mortis, where after one dies, the blood starts to settle. So because of that amount of blood in your posterior body, this purple thing here is that blood is oozing out or coming out of this stab wound. So in this particular image, you can't actually make out what the wound looks like real well because there's blood coming out of the stab wound. But that's the only one that was present on the back.
Okay. You hit clear on that. And doctor, if you want to turn in the exhibit book there to 198. Or
this is
this is
objection to the next one, Judge, just for the record.
Doctor, looking at State's Exhibit 198, don't describe what it is yet, but would that exhibit, is that going to aid you in determining where penetration wounds are inside of the body and what organs they affected and what areas of the body they affected?
Well, what this picture shows is when we make what we call a Y-shaped incision, make an incision on the chest, down to the midline, and then down the abdomen, and then we reflect the skin, the subcutaneous fat tissue, and the muscle back to expose the chest plate so we can further remove that to examine the internal organs. And in this image, it shows where that soft tissue has been exposed, and you can see focal areas of hemorrhage on the chest and abdominal area to indicate where some of these stab wounds entered the internal part of the body.
And would this exhibit aid you in explaining to the jury the injuries that, even more so than what we've seen on the external photographs?
Yes.
With that, the court will overrule the objection and the exhibit will be admitted and it may be published.
Thank you. 198. All right. I know you just explained it without the picture up there, but can you now explain it so the jury's now viewing it? So can you please explain it again?
Okay. So I realize you're not used to seeing these type of images, but all this yellow that we're looking at is adipose tissue or fat, and then you have all this is muscle here. So in these areas where there's this dark red area, that is hemorrhage that's not normally supposed to be there. And you can actually see in this area there's actually a hole in between where the ribs are in that intercostal space where some of these stab wounds have penetrated to involve the internal organs. And you can see some more hemorrhage over here on the right side of the chest. Again, this piece of soft tissue that is now up covering the lower part of her face, if you pull that back down, it would be in that lower chest area, and that dark red hemorrhage there normally would not be there. So again, that is an indication anatomically of where we're looking at injuries.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but are all of the darker spots, like even lower than where you've marked, are those all hemorrhage spots?
Yes. And then there's actually, you can see some of them in the actual omentum or the fat and the intestine.
Okay, thank you. If you want to clear that out. 199, please. And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 199?
This is the heart.
And what's significant about this, about the heart here?
Well, there's a few penetrating injuries from the stab wound. Again, I'm holding the forceps here. It's like a big pair of tweezers, showing that there is a hole there. And there's another injury down here on the lower aspect of the right ventricle. Right there. Those are the two that you can see right there.
Okay. And would either of those alone be enough to in someone's life, or is this in connection with the other wounds?
Well,
or if you don't know, you don't know.
Well, I mean, I'll say that, I mean, the cause of death is due to multiple stab wounds. Probably the ones that I would least want to sustain would be ones to the heart because of the nature of the importance of living to have your heart beating. So, these type of injuries with blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, which would further inhibit the heart's ability to beat, and then with blood starting to go into the chest cavities through that damage of the pericardial sac. Clearly, these are serious injuries that would not be immediately lethal or immediately incapacitating lesions, but unless sustaining something like this, unless you got surgical intervention within minutes or something, having some type of rescue personnel that knew what they were doing, I mean, this is alone would be enough to kill somebody.
Okay, all right. If you want to hit clear on that. Let's go to State's Exhibit 200. And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 200?
Well, this is from a different inferior vantage point. Again, similarly, before took these forceps and just lifted.
And again, just this is the heart again, correct?
Yeah, this is the heart.
Okay.
So this is that lower wound that I pointed to the last time that wasn't being opened up with the forceps there. It's just showing the size of it because in the prior image it was somewhat collapsed. So I'm just showing the significance of that injury there.
201. What do we have here in State's Exhibit 201?
Okay, well, on this board where we do the dissection, there's a portion of a heart which is visible there. So there's one lung over here, and then here is the other lung. And in this particular situation, each of the lungs has a penetrating stab wound. And in this lung here, and there's a hole, and you can actually, in the middle of that hole, you can see the bottom of that board there, that little white thing. So that hole goes all the way through the lung.
Okay. Is this the left or the right lung?
That's the left lung. The left lung has 2 lobes, where the right lung has 3 lobes. That's the way you can differentiate the two.
Okay. All right. And are there injuries on the one in the upper part of the picture? I can't remember which one. Now, you said this is the left lung. So the right lung, where are there injuries on the right lung up there?
I believe there's a separate photo.
Another, okay.
That will illustrate that.
Then we'll move on to 202, please. What are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 202?
Okay. As I just mentioned, right lung, it's 3 lobes. Right upper, right middle, right lower. So this is the right middle lobe, and there is another penetrating injury right there.
Okay. And what are these penetrating injuries due to the lungs, or how do they affect the lungs?
Well, it causes a couple of different issues. Number one, obviously, is bleeding. I mean, because the blood that your heart pumps, from the right ventricle, the blood's going to the lungs to get oxygen. So the lungs are very vascular organs, so there's bleeding. And then the other thing that can happen is when you have whether a penetrating injury from a bullet or a knife, it can cause the lung to collapse, which would make breathing or respirations even more difficult. So bleeding and a potential lung collapse are issues you have to deal with.
Okay. Would you like some water?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, all right. You want to hit clear on that, please? 203, please. Can I get 1 second here?
Yes.
Sorry. What are we looking at here, Doctor, in State's Exhibit 203?
Okay, this is a picture of the liver. So the liver, typically by weight, is the largest organ in the body. And the right lobe of the liver, which is larger, is located more on the right side of the midline, and then it sort of tapers down. Then your left lobe is a little bit smaller. So this image, this is the larger right lobe over here, and then this left lobe over here, there is a penetrating injury right there.
Okay, and what do those types of injuries do to the liver?
Well, again, the liver is another one of these organs that's very vascular. So all the blood from your lower body is just returning through the inferior vena cava to travel back to the heart to get oxygen. There's a lot of blood vessels, and damage to the liver is certainly going to cause hemorrhage. So again, I mean, it's singularly, a wound like this could cause someone's demise if they didn't get medical treatment very rapidly, but you would probably have a greater survivability if this was the only one you received versus the stab wound to the heart or to the lungs.
Okay.
But again, a very serious injury nonetheless.
Okay. You get clear on that? 204. And what do we have here in State's Exhibit 204?
Again, this is the right lobe of the liver. It's much larger, and there's a much larger kind of gaping wound here, and then a little smaller one there. There's another one down here. And as you saw from the number of these wounds that were involved on the chest and abdominal area, and with the liver being as large of an organ as it is, it really wasn't a surprise that the liver had a lot more injuries as compared to the heart or the lungs.
Okay. All right. And let's hit clear. Let's go to the next one. And 205, please. And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 205?
Okay. All right. So to explain how we examine the head and examine the brain, what we have to do is make an incision starting behind the ear and go up over the crown of the scalp, back behind the other ear, and then with a scalpel, loosen up the underneath tissue of the scalp and push the scalp forward and then pull the scalp backward to expose the calvarium, which is the big round part of the skull. So in this picture, if you could imagine, her chin would be down here. So the scalp has been pulled forward, covering her face. So when I showed you those pictures before, there was a wound on the forehead area and then 3 other small stab wounds kind of on the top of the scalp. What you can see here is there are these hemorrhagic areas in the soft tissue of the scalp which correspond to where the stab wounds were sustained. And right here, you can see that there is a little defect in the outer table of the skull, or the external part of the skull. There's a little bit of that bone is chipped away, and this is in proximity to where this damage here is on the scalp. If you pull the scalp back, so this is going to be overlying that. So as I mentioned earlier, once I did the subsequent removal of this calvarium, exposed the brain, there was no penetrating injury to the brain or any significant brain hemorrhage. Again, it's not an easy thing to do, to be able to stab an individual and make the knife go all the way through the skull. But this is just documenting that this was forceful enough that it did cause the outer part of the skull to have this defect in it.
All right, thank you. Doctor, what is a blood card?
A blood card is something that is routinely done at the time of autopsy, where we'll take part of the decedent's blood and put it on this card, which can be retained for DNA analysis if it was to correlate to a crime scene, if it had to do with the paternity issue, for males, obviously, that were warned about paternity. So it has multiple uses, but it's a way that subsequent studies can be done long after the person has been buried.
Okay. And did you create a blood card for Rachelle Bresaugh?
That is something I don't personally do.
Or was one created for her?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay. All right. And then those blood cards are, do you know if you know, did the Hamilton Police Department take that blood card?
I honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
How after it was created, I didn't know what happened to it since then.
Okay, but that's also, so that's used to determine someone's DNA?
Yes, it can be, yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. And after performing the autopsy on Ms. Bresaugh, were you able to determine a manner and a cause of death?
Yes.
And can you please explain to the jury what the difference between the two is?
Yeah. All right. The cause of death, there's a myriad of things that can be cause of death. And in today's world of forensic pathology, the most common thing we deal with now are drug overdoses, fentanyl intoxication, multiple drug intoxication, traffic accidents, blunt force injury of the head or blunt force injury of the chest, gunshot wounds, stab wounds, drowning, electrocution. Sometimes we'll do an autopsy on someone and it end up being a natural cause. Someone didn't know they had heart disease or they had an undiagnosed cancer, things of that nature. So that's what the cause of death is, whether it's something natural or unnatural, which leads into the discussion about manner of death. So manner of death on the death certificate, there are 5 options. You have to check one of these boxes. So it's either homicide, suicide, accident, natural, or could not be determined. That the could not be determined is when you have an apparently healthy 25-year-old person, and then after the autopsy there's no obvious grossly identifiable cause of death. You do toxicology testing, that's negative. You look at slides under the microscope and you can't identify anything. So in those kind of cases, maybe it's a congenital heart arrhythmia that we can't identify at autopsy, or maybe it's some substance that was taken that the toxicology labs aren't able to identify yet. So we don't have many of those undetermined cases. So most of them, we're pretty good at being able to make a definitive ruling on the manner.
All right. And doctor, using your education and training and years of experience, were you able to come to an opinion or to a reasonable degree of medical certainty to an opinion of the cause of death and manner of death of Rachelle Bresaugh?
Yes, I was.
And what was your opinion as to the cause of death?
Multiple stab wounds.
And what was your opinion to the manner of death?
Well, just to clarify, my opinion that the manner of death is a homicide. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't actually sign the death certificate because Dr. Mannix, who's the elected coroner of Butler County, she's the one that signs the death certificate.
Okay.
But I certainly would classify this as a homicide, yes.
All right, thank you. Can I have 1 second? Doctor, I do have one other question. When you performed this autopsy, can you tell the jury about the internal bleeding you saw, and was there a lot of blood in her body or not in her body, or?
Right.
Can you explain that, please?
Yeah. Well, what I attempt to do is when we have anything where there's some kind of blunt force injury, attempt to measure any quantifiable blood volume that's in the different cavities of the body. And in this particular case, there was, and I say approximately 900 milliliters of blood, or almost a liter. 1,000 milliliters is a liter. So almost a liter of blood in the right chest cavity, 700 milliliters in the left chest cavity, and then another 100 in the pericardial sac, which is the sac that surrounds the heart. So just adding that up, that was 1,700 milliliters or 1.7 liters of blood that I was able to recover from the cavities. Now, obviously, there's still blood in her body. As you could see from that picture, we had her rolled over on her side to show her back. There's still blood that is coming out of some of these injuries. So I can't say how much blood was still in her soft tissues and muscle, but at least I was able to document how much was present in her internal cavities.
Okay, and just how much blood is in a person's body as you sit here today, or roughly?
Well, I mean, it's going to vary based on the size of the person, whether they're well hydrated or not. I mean, you're talking about, possibly 4 to 5 liters of blood.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I think that's all I have. Thank you, Doctor.
All right, thank you.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
I want to talk to you first about during your testimony, you referred to stab wounds throughout. And if I could have the state pull up Exhibit 187 so I could talk to the doctor about that. Doctor, are you able to see State's Exhibit 187?
Yes, I can see it.
And I want to talk to you a minute about when you say stab wounds. Now, what's the difference between a stab wound and a cut, a nick, a scrape? Why do we use the word stab wound during your testimony?
Well, typically, you're right, there are different terminology. A stab wound is typically a wound that's deeper than it is on the surface, where an incised wound, where someone has had their throat cut, where the wound is longer on the surface than it is deep. And then the term you used, a cut, I mean, a cut could be a paper cut, very superficial on your finger, or a cut could be more of an incised wound, something that's very superficial on the surface.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask if, for instance, if I'm working in my garage with a cutting knife, cutting up cardboard, and I slice my finger, I don't walk in and go, I just stabbed my finger. Stab seems to connote that you know exactly what caused these injuries and how they were. Is that what you're trying to tell us today, that you know exactly how all this occurred and what caused these injuries?
Well, the majority of the injuries are stab wounds because they're deeper penetrating injury than a more superficial incised wound, or even if you were in your garage and you cut your finger, that would be more of an incision. If you think of the term like a surgical incision.
Okay.
So there are some of these things on her body, which I alluded to earlier, that they were so superficial, whether it was something that occurred and a couple contusions that could be associated with a fall or just some sort of glancing injury. But I mean, I've done enough autopsies on people that had sustained multiple stab wounds that I'm familiar with what the variable appearances that some of these stab wounds may have, even if the same implement was used.
Some of these you described as superficial. Were you including those as one of the 55 stab wounds you noted in your report?
Some of them, no.
Give us an idea on 187. And I'm talking about, obviously we can tell some of the bigger cuts here, but some of these smaller portions of her body, which you consider a stab wound, some of the smaller ones.
You want me to start pointing out stab wounds?
Yes.
It might be easier for me to point out the ones that aren't stab wounds. So all these things that I put these little dots, or clearly stab wounds. Something that would be more of a superficial scratch, scrape, incised wound would be something like that, something like that, something right there. I mean, so in this picture, I mean, the majority of these things are stab wounds. There's a few that, like I said, an incised wound typically is something that's longer on the surface than it is deep, that I wouldn't classify as a penetrating stab wound. So there's a few in this particular image that I did not count as a stab wound.
Okay. And I guess I also want to talk to you, when we hear, it's common when we hear the word stab, we think of things going directly into the body. Are you describing these stabs as you're saying that something went straight into the body or just may have nicked or scraped the body?
Well, I'm not saying that they necessarily went in straight. Again, a couple different factors why these things can look so different. Number one, if the individual is moving, when you're trying to hit a moving target, they're not always going to be the same. Depending on whether you hit bone beneath the soft tissue, that may impede how deep the knife can penetrate the body. Clearly, some of these wounds were able to travel between the ribs and penetrate deep enough to hit the lung, hit the liver, hit the heart, hit the intestine, where some of the other ones were much more superficial, so it basically only penetrated the skin and got into the fat. So there's a varying assortment of wounds on the body.
You kind of got into the next area I want to talk to you about movement. These injuries that we see here, some of these cuts, these wounds could have been in the process of while this person was moving, correct?
It's certainly possible. I believe, in my personal opinion, because there's not one immediately lethal injury, it's certainly possible that there was an interval where this person is moving, and because of so many of the different orientations, many times if an individual is stabbed and they're not moving, there's a very more of an organized orientation of wounds, and in this particular case, they're really not that organized in that respect. So it's consistent with some movement during the event.
Okay. And you would agree with me that, you weren't at the scene, you don't have a video to see exactly what happened, but movement could not only be someone trying to get away from someone stabbing them, correct? They could be moving away from the person who's trying to stab them.
Absolutely, yes.
It also could be that the person who has a stab wound is approaching the person who may have a knife, and there may be some sort of physical altercation going on between the two of them.
Yeah, I wasn't there, but certainly that's a possibility.
Right. At the end of the day, you don't know what physical altercation, if any, preceded or occurred during any of these cuts and these wounds.
That's correct.
You talked about liters of blood, and obviously, a bigger person has more blood. What's like I think you said Rachelle was 230 pounds. Do you have, based on your experience, your background, your training, approximately how much blood she would have as a 230-pound female?
Well, it's hard for me to, kind of in general, I think I previously stated, 4 to 5 liters, for a full-grown adult. But obviously, someone who's 7 feet tall versus someone who's 5 feet tall, and then depending on their body habitus, some could have more, some could have less. Like I stated earlier, I measured what I could that was in the body cavities. But one of the things that you look at when someone has had a significant blood loss, we look at the kidneys, because there's a phenomenon called shock kidney. Because what your body does is, in an attempt to, when you're actively hemorrhaging, you start shunting blood from your lower extremities and your lower half of your body to try to keep blood going to your brain, try to keep blood going to your lungs so you can continue to try to oxygenate. And in some of those cases, people's kidneys can be really, really pale when they've literally, exsanguinated to death. In this particular situation, her kidneys were not really pale like you would see in a shot kidney. So she did lose a lot of blood, but I think it's undeniable that because of where her injuries were, it affected the ability of her heart to adequately pump. Blood was starting to accumulate in the pericardial sac surrounding her heart, and she's going to potentially have collapsed lungs because of the damage to the lungs. So although she does have a lot of internal hemorrhage, I didn't sort of rubber stamp this and say that, call it an exsanguination, because of the loss of the functional ability of her to adequately breathe and then perfuse her tissues because of the damage to her heart.
Does a 230-pound woman have the same amount of blood as a 130-pound woman? Let me ask it that way.
I would say that the larger woman would most likely have more blood than the smaller woman.
And I myself, 40 pounds heavier than the person in this, would you guess that I may have more blood than the Rachelle?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. If the state could pull up Exhibit 33, please. It's already been exhibited. 33. Doctor, I'm showing you where Rachelle was found in the home. This is the crime scene. Based on the amount of blood that would have been in her body and all the injuries that you've shown to us, including something on the wrist where it was so deep that it went down into her tendon, does it surprise you that we don't see more blood in this picture?
Well, honestly, I would expect to possibly see more blood than what I'm seeing here. I mean, obviously there's blood on that cardboard box, there's blood on the floor, blood on the rug. There's some degree of blood on her clothing. Of course, it's a dark shirt and she's wearing kind of darker pants. But I mean, sometimes in these cases, there are sometimes a large, like coagulated pool of blood, and I don't see that in this particular case.
Right, and particularly with around her wrist, we were shown a picture where you said the white part of that was basically so deep we're looking at tendon. We see both of her wrists in this picture. Would you expect, based off the injury you see later on, that there would be more blood near her wrist here?
Well, the thing that I can't answer is, and I alluded to it earlier, I can't tell you the sequence of the injuries that she sustained. Clearly, I think that one was an antemortem wound, meaning that she was still alive because of the relative amount of soft tissue hemorrhage that was present in the wrist. But I don't know if that's one of the wounds that happened, later in the assault, once her blood pressure had been significantly diminished. I mean, there is more blood on the adjacent on the floor by the left as opposed to the right, but again, not a huge pool.
Okay. You can go ahead and clear the picture out, please. When, I think you talked about this a little bit, but all the pictures that you testified about today, her body appeared to be, when I say clean, it doesn't, let me strike and rephrase this. When her body was presented to you, was the skin that was untouched by any wounds, was it just covered in blood and smeared with dry blood?
I mean, not a tremendous amount, but it's one of the, I think probably the first picture that showed her chest and abdomen. That was one of the unclean pictures because there was, dry blood there. And then the subsequent picture that showed, I believe, the left half of her body, you could tell a difference because that one had been cleaned, but it wasn't like her body was just completely covered in blood.
Okay. Did you yourself do any cleaning of the body in order to examine the wounds?
I don't do the cleaning of the body.
Were you made aware of how much blood was on her body that needed to be washed away in order for you to do your autopsy?
Well, I saw her before that occurred, but I didn't actually clean her body myself, but I saw the condition that she was in on those initial photographs that were taken.
Okay. Next, I want to talk to you. You used the word during your direct examination, you were referred to defensive wounds. When you do your autopsy, is there anyone from law enforcement that's present when you're doing that autopsy?
Sometimes there are.
Do you recall if someone from this examination of Rachelle, there was someone present?
Honestly, I can't remember on that. I mean, it's been almost 2 years ago. I can't remember just who was there or who wasn't there.
Is that something you would note in your report if someone was present from law enforcement?
Not necessarily, because, I mean, there have been other occasions where sometimes a police officer will walk in halfway through a case or, stay for 10 minutes and leave. So it's one of those things that I don't, include that person in my report. I mean, I believe there is a log there at the Butler County morgue for people to sign in when they come there. But so you'd have to refer to that because I didn't obviously include anybody's attendance in my report.
Right. And I know a lot's happened for you in the last 2 years. I know you're through Did you get any information on this case? Does anybody provide you, hey, this woman's coming in, may have been stabbed? Did you have any information about the background of this case or the investigation?
Well, basically, when I was called to come to perform this autopsy, I mean, I was told that we have an individual who's sustained multiple stab wounds, and it was being investigated as a homicide. So that was basically what I was told.
Okay. But you don't get any information about who may have done it or how she's found or anything like that, are you?
Well, I mean, they typically they're not telling me who did it unless it was witnessed by other people or someone has admitted to doing it. I mean, obviously the police have to do their investigation and they've got suspects or whatever, but at the time I did the autopsy, I did not know that there had been any definitive determination as to who the perpetrator was.
Okay. You described something. We're going to keep talking about this defensive word that you use with regards to the hands, but you could also get under someone's fingernails and maybe find their DNA or their cells to suggest someone was clawing at someone who may be trying to stab them. Could you not do that?
Potentially, yes.
And that would dem indicate something was defensive. Is that fair?
Yes.
All right. If the state could please pull up 182. You said that this is her left hand. I know we have pictures of both her hands, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you described anything as defensive, you're referring to her hands. Is that fair?
Well, hands and the arms, yes.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the hands. You described this as being caused by blunt force. Blunt force contusion to the hand could be caused by striking something with your hand. Is that fair?
Yes.
If I were to punch this podium right now, I could cause a contusion to my own hand.
Yes.
And we wouldn't know whether or not if that was truly defensive or if that was offensive. Is that fair?
Yes.
Hitting your hand on a piece of furniture could also cause a contusion. Is that fair?
Yes.
If you're struggling with someone and you fall to the ground or your hand hits something hard, that could cause a contusion on your hand as well, correct?
Yes.
Also, with some of these wounds, these stabs, these cuts, these scrapes, if a person were to have a small pocket knife in their hand and maybe using it themselves, is it possible that they could cut themselves?
Well, the location of where some of these wounds are in their orientation, I would find that kind of hard to believe that these were, what, you're saying self-inflicted wounds?
I didn't say self-inflicted. Let me ask it this way. Hypothetically, you and I are in an argument and I have a small pocket knife in my hand and I may try to move it towards you, and in the process I miss you. I can cut my hand on my own in that scenario, can I not?
I guess that's a possibility.
All right. Because you described a lot of these wounds, these cuts, these scrapes as all different shapes and sizes, and there's movement going on. So at the end of the day, you can't sit here and tell us that we know exactly how these wounds were made. You can't do that, right?
That's correct.
You can't tell us exactly what instrument or object caused these, correct?
That's correct.
And you cannot tell us what was going on with before, during, and after these wounds are being applied to this person, correct?
Yes.
And you can't tell us that there's two people involved, whether one person or the other inflicted them.
That's correct.
Were you ever provided a photograph of knives collected at the scene for comparison with these wounds?
I have seen a picture of a knife that I wasn't told that it was definitively the knife, but something that was recovered.
So you actually had the knife, or you just had a photo of it?
I've just seen a picture.
You've seen a picture of the knife, and then did you go back and look at your photos and look at your report to compare and contrast?
Well, when I saw the image of this potential knife, what was potentially consistent is the fact it wasn't a very big knife. Right. I mean, if you take a 6-inch, 8-inch butcher knife, typically like you'd see in the wood block in the kitchen, you don't see these kind of small wounds. You see these very deep wounds that create these gaping type of injuries in the liver, in the lung, in the heart. Based on the number of stab wounds and the relative few number of them that actually penetrated an organ, it's consistent that it's a smaller knife than a very huge, long-bladed knife. But again, you could take the same knife and get varying kinds of injuries depending on whether you full contact or a glancing blow or came in at a different angle. So I can't look at a picture of a smaller knife and say, well, that clearly caused this, or that it clearly didn't cause it. It's just it's more consistent that it was a smaller knife than a very big, long blade knife.
You did testify that some of the injuries in this case went so deep as to puncture heart, lungs, and liver, correct?
Yes.
Are you able to use a pocket knife to get down as deep as the liver? It's on the outside of the skin down to the liver with a pocket knife?
The liver is probably the easiest of those three organs that you mentioned, because anatomically, the liver is kind of just beneath the right side of that costal margin of the rib cage, and it can extend downward below that. So you might not even have to go through in between ribs to damage the liver. And again, the liver is much larger. So just based on the number of the wounds, it makes sense statistically that the liver was affected more than the heart or the lung. But when you consider you have the sternum, which is the breastbone, and then with these ribs emanating from it, it's not, the heart isn't as readily or easily damaged as compared to something like the liver or the intestines.
All right. That's what I was going to ask about next. The heart would be a little more difficult to, the injury that we see from the heart, that would be a little bit more difficult, in your opinion, in a pocket knife to do as opposed to the liver. Is that fair?
Yes.
For the reasons you just explained about the heart. Say yes?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, I thought at some point you mentioned, you said some wounds don't show subcutaneous bleeding. Are you suggesting that some of these were applied after someone was already, that she was already dead when someone stabbed her?
Well, it's possible that they were either after she was technically deceased, or the fact that it was in that close interval where her blood pressure was so low because of the blood loss that some of those wounds weren't being adequately perfused, as I mentioned earlier, which is why we didn't see the shot kidney phenomenon. But again, a lot of the blood is going to be shunted up towards the chest and the head. So some of those abdominal wounds, towards the end of death, there may not be the same amount of blood flow as there was when this event started.
Judge, can I have a minute to talk to my client?
All right, as always, it ends with the defense attorney asking the client if he wants to add anything because he's been very active in his defense. Now, at times today, he seemed to either be falling asleep or just totally zoning it out.
Emotional, too, during times that seemed more innocuous.
And his poor daughter, the victim's daughter, his daughter, she's in those images that she is enduring. And like we were talking, most times people leave the courtroom, victim family members, because it's too much. She wants to stay there. And notice when she was shaking her head when the defense attorney asked, well, could this be multiple people? You could feel the disgust coming from her.
Right. I mean, what she's had to endure, but it seems like she wants to be there for her mother. She wants to know everything that happened.
Heartbreaking.